The space race was part of the conflict between the United States and Soviet Union, the Cold War. They had beaten us to space and gotten the first man to space. Now, we just had to beat them to the moon. John F. Kennedy set the goal to reach the moon and had NASA establish the Apollo program. After overcoming overwhelming odds, the Apollo program triumphed and was able to send 2 men to the moon, achieving the dream of John F. Kennedy, though it was not without tragedy, as brave astronauts had died previously in the Apollo program. The predecessors of the Apollo program were the Apollo-Saturn uncrewed missions, AS-201, a unmanned flight of the Apollo Command and Service Module, tested the structural integrity and capability of launch vehicle and other functions. It took off February 26, 1966. Later that summer, AS-203 was launched, used to test the technology to boost astronauts from Earth's orbit. Apollo 204, or Apollo 1, was to be the first manned Apollo mission. The launch was to be February 21, 1967, but then tragedy struck. On January 27, 1964, during a pre-flight test, astronauts Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee were all killed in the tragic fire that swept through the command module. The day of the test, the crew detected a foul odor in the breathing oxygen, which took about an hour to fix. There were also communication problems, which caused the practice countdown to be delayed. At 6:31 p.m., the fire was reported. The fire was started by a faulty wire igniting the flammable gas in the side of the simulator. The crew struggled to open the door. By the time the doors opened, it was too late. It would be a year and a half until NASA would try another manned mission. They redesigned the doors to open easier. Flammable items were removed, and the flammable gas inside the rockets and simulators was replaced with non-flammable gases. The program would go through many tests in preparation for a trip to the moon. A notable accomplishment in their work was the Apollo 8 mission. This mission was the second Apollo mission with a crew. It was also the first mission to use NASA's new powerful Saturn V rocket, which had not been previously tested on humans. In an attempt to beat out the Soviets, they greenlit the project, confident in the astronauts' safety. The 6-day mission began on December 21, 1968. The crew on board was Frank Bornum, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. NASA was able to get the crew into orbit and then orbit the moon. The mission proved that NASA was getting closer to JFK's dream. Apollo 9 launched on the 3rd of March, 1969. The goal was to perform an engineering test of the first crewed lunar module that would be necessary to land on the moon. The LM was also to be tested so it could be self-sufficient. Another priority was the CSM and LM docking. There were no major problems on the return flight back to Earth. 2 months after the success of Apollo 9, Apollo 10 would launch from Cape Kennedy at 12:49 p.m. on May 18, 1969. This would be NASA's 4th Apollo mission, with a crew, and the second mission to orbit the moon, triumphing the odds. On this mission, humans got closer than they'd ever been to the moon. They got as close as 4,700 feet from the surface of the moon. This showed that NASA was getting closer than ever to reaching Kennedy's dreams. The astronauts broadcasted the mission in full-color TV to millions of American homes. They were able to get thousands of pictures and proved to the Soviets that NASA was a force to be reckoned with. The mission lasted 8 days, and the crew was able to splash down at 12:52 p.m., May 26, 1969. 2 months later, the 11th Apollo mission launched. This mission was probably the most important mission for NASA in the 1960s, and a major triumph for NASA. Their crew consisted of 3 experienced astronauts: Neil Armstrong, the pilot of Gemini 8, Buzz Aldrin, the pilot of Gemini 12, and Michael Collins. The pilot of Gemini 10 were chosen to be part of the Apollo 11 crew. Prior to the launch, NASA has studied the moon's surface and sun patterns to determine when and where the best landing spots. At 9:32 a.m. on July 16, 1969, the Apollo 11 spacecraft was launched from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. There were a total of 3 broadcasts of space from the crew. Eventually, the crew became close enough to the moon to attach the lunar module with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in it and land on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This was a huge victory for NASA and one of the biggest moments in American history to date. The LM landed in a large plain of basalt called the Sea of Tranquility. It was here where the crew aboard the LM would spend 21.5 hours conducting experiments, putting a flag on the lunar surface, taking soil samples, and taking samples of certain parts of the lunar surface. Total, Neil Armstrong spent about 2.5 hours outside of the Eagle, the nickname for the command module. After 21.5 hours, the LM docked with the command service module, and the astronauts began to head home. The spacecraft landed in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th near the recovery ship, and the mission was a success. Apollo 12 was the second mission with the goal of achieving a lunar landing and deploying more scientific experiments. There are other scientific objectives. November 14th, 1969. It was a 10-day mission that underwent no significant problems, and the astronauts returned to Earth safely. The next mission will be known throughout American history as a near tragedy. Apollo 13 was close to tragedy. It was the third lunar landing attempt that was aborted due to the rupture of an oxygen tank. Days before the launch, command module pilot Ken Mattingly was exposed to measles and was replaced by Jack Swigert. The astronauts for this mission were to be Jack Swigert, Jim Lovell, and Fred Haise. The number 2 oxygen tank acted up when they were supposed to be emptied. The shuttle launched on April 11, 1970, during the first 2 days of the flight. Everything went well. 9 minutes after the crew completed a 49-minute broadcast back to Earth, a major problem occurred. The second oxygen tank blew, which caused the failure of the first one, while they were 200,000 miles from Earth. The crew was alerted by the bang and the warning lights. Next, multiple fuel cells and primary sources of the ship energy ruptured. The astronauts saw that they were venting gas into space. They did not yet know that the gas was oxygen. They first tried to close the CM and LM hatch. Then they realized that it was not a cabin leak. It is slowly going to zero, and we are starting to think about the LM lifeboat. As oxygen ran out and little energy left, it was decided to use the LM to get back. Now there is plenty of oxygen in the LM, with oxygen packs which would never be used on the lunar surface. Power was a concern to get back to Earth. During the trip, all non-critical systems were shut down, and power consumption was reduced by 1/5. The main consumable concern was water. They were estimated to run out 5 hours before re-entry. Trying to conserve food and water throughout the mission, the astronauts in total lost 31.5 pounds. Another major problem was the removal of carbon dioxide. After just a day and a half, they were at dangerous levels, but they used lithium hydroxide canisters from the CM to remove it. It was also hard for them to verify a course to return safely, even though they had just transferred the CM navigational platform. They had no onboard computer to verify the AOT, or Alignment Optical Telescope, which found a suitable navigation star. They, in the end, used the sun as an alignment star. During the trip, it was very discomforting with the lack of food and water. There was also the cold due to lack of energy leading to the loss of an important heat source. One of the most remarkable parts was creating new procedures so quickly. Eventually, on April 17, 1970, they splashed down the Pacific Ocean. Afterward, during an investigation, they learned the cause of the explosions. The Apollo program has made an extremely large impact on space travel. NASA has had tragic ends to attempted missions such as the Apollo 1 fire, and major triumphs such as getting a man to the moon. The Apollo program has changed the way we look at space. Although with some tragedies, we triumphed over the difficulties of sending men to space and beyond.